Have you ever looked out at the night and wondered what the world was like long ago? Tonight, let us go back to a time of silk gowns, quiet castles, and decisions that changed lives forever. This is not a loud story. It began in silence, in a cold, foggy kingdom where even the wind moved slowly. There was a castle on a hill, old and tired, with soft candlelight glowing behind thick glass. Inside, a queen sat at her writing desk. She was not very old, but she had known enough seasons to understand that beauty often hides sorrow. She wore a simple dress, and beside her sat a feather pen, a blank page, and a crown she never really asked for. The room was warm, filled with dried flowers and the smell of ink, but outside, the land was quiet, too quiet. The crops had not grown well that year. The people were waiting for help, but the help did not come. Far away, in small villages hidden between trees and rivers, the poor had begun to whisper about a strange food. A potato. It came from the ground, strong and plain. It could grow in cold places. It could feed many, but the queen did not trust it. She thought it was dirty, ugly, not fit for her kingdom. She believed the food on a royal table should look delicate, like poetry, not like something dug from the dirt. So she made a choice. She quietly told her advisors, no more potatoes. Not in the royal gardens, not in the markets, not in the fields. No questions were asked. Her word was law. And so, the soil remained empty. The farmers obeyed, even when their children began to grow thin. Back in the castle, the queen wrote poems about the sky and verses about grace. She did not write about hunger. She did not speak of the people outside her walls. But sometimes, at night, she would walk to the window. She would look out at the hills, and once she saw a small home far below, with no smoke rising from its chimney. A woman stood near it, holding a pot, but there was nothing inside. The queen watched and said nothing. She turned away, letting the window frost over. On her desk, a sealed letter waited. It came from a village mayor. It asked for help, for seeds, for mercy. But she never opened it. The candle beside it burned low, and the ink dried in her pen. History would later call her foolish. Some would say cruel. But in that moment, she thought silence was safer than change. She thought pride was stronger than hunger, and so she did nothing. The fire in the villages faded. The fields turned to dust, and the queen kept writing poems. She didn't know it yet, but her name would be remembered not for her beauty or her wisdom, but for the one thing she refused to plant. A mistake so simple that it could feed the world. If any listener's eyes were feeling heavy, this was only the beginning, because soon the earth would begin to answer. There was something quiet growing beneath the soil, something small, round, and steady. The people had learned about it from travelers who came with rough hands and warmer coats, who spoke of faraway lands where this root had saved entire villages from starvation. It wasn't beautiful. It had no perfume. It sat heavy in the palm, like a stone, and looked like nothing worth writing about. But when boiled, it filled the belly. When roasted, it warmed the bones. It grew even when the cold stayed too long or the rains came too early. For the poor, it was not a miracle. It was simply survival. They called it a potato. It had no place at a royal banquet, no role in the songs sung at court. But in the dirt behind old barns, in corners of forgotten fields, it waited. It waited for someone to believe in it. Farmers who had nothing left began to look at the ground with new hope. They saw the soil not as tired, but as ready. And so they began to plant just a few, at first. Quietly, secretly. They did not ask permission. They did not tell the palace. They only knelt and pushed the potatoes into the earth, hoping that when the frost passed, something would rise in, return. But word spread quickly in places where nothing else moved fast. It reached the ears of men who served the queen, men who believed that obedience was more important than hunger. One day, a rider came down from the castle, his cloak heavy with gold threads. He did not speak with kindness. He carried a scroll, and when he read it aloud, the words fell like cold rain. Potatoes were to be banned. Any planting must stop. Any harvest must be destroyed. There would be no more mercy for food that did not wear the right name. In the queen's eyes, the potato was dangerous not because it harmed, but because it didn't ask for approval. It didn't bow. It didn't shine. It simply grew. She had never touched one. She had only heard that it came from dark places, that it grew underground, hidden, that it spread without permission. And so she feared it. She feared that if the poor could feed themselves with something so simple, they would no longer look to her with open hands. She feared that hunger was the one thing she still controlled. In her chambers, she spoke softly to her advisors, her voice gentle but firm. A kingdom must have dignity, she said. It must not rely on ugly things. It must choose order over desperation. And so the order was made. In the fields, farmers pulled up their tiny sprouts and watched the holes fill with water. In the villages, mothers who had waited through winter saw their last hope carried away in sacks, taken not by thieves but by soldiers. And still, the queen wrote. She did not write about the decree. She wrote about gardens that bloomed with white roses, about lakes that stayed still even when the wind moved, about the way silence could feel like peace if you believed in it hard enough. But her people were not at peace. They were quiet, but not peaceful. They were cold, but not calm. And in the soil, the memory of the potato remained. Not in seed, not in root, but in longing. The kind of longing that settles deep inside the body and does not go away. If anyone listening had begun to drift, now was a gentle time to follow the story forward toward the days when hunger no longer whispered, but sat openly at the table. The queen wrapped in tapestries and tucked within. Her quiet castle believed her kingdom had grown quiet because peace had returned. But outside the stone walls, there was only stillness because there was nothing left to move. In the highlands, sheep grazed on patches of snow-dusted grass, too thin to be sheared, too few to matter. In the towns, bakers opened their shops not to sell bread, but to sweep the floor and stare at empty shelves. Old women gave up their favorite scarves so the fabric could be used for patching windows that let in the cold. A single egg was now a gift, a spoonful of broth a celebration. Children no longer asked what was for supper. They already knew the answer: nothing. In the queen's garden, roses still bloomed, watered by handmaids who did not speak of wilted wheat or stolen soil. One evening, she asked a musician to play for her, something soft, something filled with air. He played a lullaby his grandmother had sung while stirring soup. The melody was slow, sweet and sad. When it ended, the queen clapped gently, but her eyes looked far away. That same night, down in a village square, a farmer stood before a small group of neighbors with an old wooden box in his arms. Inside it were 5 potatoes, soft, bruised, and starting to sprout. He had kept them hidden in a wall for months, beneath straw and stone. "We can't eat them," he said, "but we can try again." No one cheered, but they knelt, one by one, and placed those 5 potatoes into the ground like prayers. Above them, the sky held no stars, only cloud. In the castle, the queen wrote a letter to a distant cousin in another country, asking if he had any artists who could visit to paint spring flowers. She wanted something bright, something hopeful. Her cousin never replied. The queen assumed he was busy. She never guessed he was dead lost to the same famine she had helped create. In the south, a young boy walked for days to deliver a basket. of turnips to his grandmother. When he arrived, she had already gone. Her house was locked, her fire out. He left the turnips on the step and sat beside them, waiting. When the snow began to fall, he curled against the basket, holding it like a memory. In a tavern far from the capital, a bard began to tell a new story, one not of heroes or dragons, but of a queen who feared a root. The listeners didn't laugh. They only nodded, their heads heavy with knowing. And in secret gardens, in corners of ruins, beneath broken stairs and behind chapel stones, small hands returned to the dirt. No longer hiding, no longer afraid. Because even if the law stood tall, the people were hungry, and hunger does not wait. A year passed, then two. The queen grew older, though her mirror did not tell her so. She still wore white gowns and wrote verses in the margins of her journal, but sometimes she forgot the endings. Sometimes she looked out at her garden and did not remember what the flowers were called. One spring morning, a young maid entered. The queen studied to bring her tea. She paused at the threshold. On the queen's desk was a small bowl of steamed potatoes. No salt, no butter, just warmth. The queen looked at the maid and smiled faintly. "Someone left them," she said, "in the kitchen. I thought I'd try." The maid said nothing. She bowed and left. And the queen sat alone, staring at the bowl. She did not lift a fork. But she did not throw it away either. The air smelled of thawed soil, and a blackbird began to sing its song, simple, repeating, as if remembering something it had never forgotten. As time passed, gently, like a fading song, the queen's quiet bowl of potatoes remained untouched. She did not speak of it, nor did she ask again for more, but something invisible had shifted in the rhythm of her halls. Outside, where the wind still rolled low across the hills, the hunger had not ended, but neither had the planting. And far away, in a forgotten village where even the church bells had stopped ringing, a child repeated a story he had overheard, a tale of a queen who had once feared a root, but had kept a bowl of it on her desk without turning it away. The story changed as it moved. In some places, it became a fable. In others, a lullaby. But always it carried the same soft echo the queen had seen. And because she had seen, perhaps now things might be allowed to grow. In the lowlands, a woman gave her daughter a satchel of sprouting seeds and kissed her forehead before sending her to the forest edge. In the north, two brothers built a fence around a patch of earth and called it Tomorrow's Garden. Even in the cities, where stone covered every inch of soil, pots appeared on windowsills, small, clay vessels cradling leaves that reached upward like slow hands. The queen knew none of this. She continued her days in quiet repetition, writing verses about rivers she had never seen, sketching tulips that did not bloom. But sometimes she would pause mid-sentence and stare at the window as if someone had whispered her name. When the prime minister arrived to deliver news of trade or war, she would listen kindly but ask no questions. And when he left, she would return to her writing, dipping her pen in ink that had dried just slightly at the edges. Then, one morning, the cook who had once served 12 courses for every royal feast brought only bread and broth. The queen said nothing. She dipped her spoon and sipped slowly. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees in a way that felt almost new. In the village schools, the children were asked to draw the queen. Many drew her holding a potato like a crown. One drew her sitting beneath a tree with roots spreading from her feet into the earth. The teacher smiled and did not correct them. The queen's name had changed, not officially, not by law, but in the quiet corners where stories are carried like smoke. She was no longer Her Majesty. She had become the queen who saw. The world did not heal all at once. The famine did not lift in a single season. But as each morning arrived with a little more warmth than the one before, it brought with it the faint promise that maybe, someday, things would grow again, not because of a law or a crown, but because of the people who chose to plant anyway. Years passed, and the silence that once filled the palace halls softened into something else, something closer to memory. The queen's hair turned silver like the morning mist, and though her steps grew slower, her presence remained gentle, like a breeze that never wished to disturb. She still wrote each day, though the lines came slower now, and often trailed off into soft pauses. Her pages were no longer filled with flowers or verses, but with quiet recollections of hands in soil, of bowls left full, of names she had never spoken aloud. Outside the castle, a new kind of music drifted across the land, not from choirs or orchestras, but from fields in bloom. The soil had begun to sing again, not with fanfare, but with rustling leaves and roots reaching through the earth like long-forgotten lullabies. The people did not forget the famine. They carried it with them not as anger, but as a lesson. A lesson taught not by speeches or statues, but by planting. They taught their children how to dig carefully, how to thank the ground before taking from it, how to share a harvest even when it was small. And in quiet corners, they still told the story of the queen, not as a villain, not as a hero, but as a reminder that power is not always loud, that mistakes can be planted as easily as seeds, and that sometimes the most lasting changes grow from silence. One autumn, a festival was held not at the palace, but in a village square far from stone walls. Baskets of food lined long tables, and a single chair was left empty at the head. On it rested a crown made from woven wheat and dried potato vines. No one claimed it. No one needed to. It sat as a symbol, not of royalty, but of regret turned into care. In the final years of her life, the queen no longer asked for musicians. She preferred the sounds of the wind through trees, the gentle tapping of rain on her chamber window, and the creak of the wooden floor as she walked slowly, hand trailing along old walls. Her maid once found her sitting in the garden, her lap filled with peeled potatoes, her hands moving slowly, steadily, no longer afraid of the route she once banned. "They don't frighten me," she said softly, "not anymore." She passed one evening in her sleep. There was no grand procession, no fanfare, only candlelight and a soft rain falling on the castle roof. She was buried in the royal gardens, near a tree that had grown from a child's hidden seed. And on the stone above her name, someone carved a single line. She learned too late, but she let it grow. And so, the story ended, not with thunder, but with roots. Long after the queen was gone, and the halls had fallen quiet for good, her story remained not on the tongues of scholars or in the pages of grand books, but in the low hum of fires lit for warmth, in the quiet prayers before planting, in the hands that worked the soil with patience. Children still asked why potatoes were once banned, and the elders answered not with anger, but with care, because understanding was softer than blame. In village schools, history was not taught with dates or battles, but with tales told in the hush of dusk, the tale of a queen who once feared the root beneath her feet, and then, much later, learned to let it grow. Her story was not a warning, nor a triumph. It was a thread woven through the fabric of time, delicate and strong. In fields where once there was dust, potatoes now grew in rows that looked like lines of poetry, humble and full. Each season brought new hands to the earth, and each harvest carried with it a small, invisible note. We remember, we learn, we grow. Even the castle, once cold with silence, became part of the story. Its stones remained, covered in ivy and moss, visited not by nobles, but by wanderers who came to stand where the queen once sat. Some left offerings, not coins, but seeds. Some sat and simply listened, as if the air itself still carried her sighs. On the western wall, beneath the highest window, someone etched another line beside the old stone. "May we plant with care and rule with kindness." And so it ended, not with grandeur, but with quiet. Not with a lesson shouted, but with a feeling passed down like a lullaby. The queen who banned potatoes would never be forgotten, but not because of her mistake. Because of how deeply it rooted itself in the hearts of those who chose not to forget. And if your eyes have grown heavy, you rest knowing that even in silence, change can take root. We'll meet again in another quiet chapter from the past, and now, with the story tucked softly behind us, let the night carry its gentle hush. The tale of the queen who feared the root has faded like candle smoke into the quiet corners of your mind. Her steps no longer echo in the halls, but her memory lingers soft, earthy, and still. If your eyes feel heavy, let them close, knowing that in the end, even silence can bloom. And in the soil of forgotten mistakes, new stories will always grow. Sleep well, wanderer of history. We'll meet again in another quiet chapter from the past.